The First Law of Magic, Chapter 4, Part 2. The air distorted and rippled in the blast's wake, until it impacted the wolf's paw with a sharp crack. Recoiling in agony, the wolf let out an ear-piercing shriek of confusion and pain, chunks of its paw flying in all directions. Twilight blinked. She had never been able to muster a push so strong in her entire life, and stranger still was the connection that she had felt with the wolf when she felt her magic touch it again. There was a familiarity there, almost as if the creature's innate magic was close to her own. A sudden crack drew her eye to the branch that she had been standing on. The ancient oak was strong and able to easily support her weight mere seconds ago, but now it was thin, sickly, and sported blackened sections that seemed to have grown from around her hooves. Thinking quickly, the unicorn scrambled closer to the tree trunk. She narrowly avoided the rest of the branch as it creaked and snapped under the combined effort of the sudden rod and her clambering hooves. She tossed a quick glance up at Fluttershy, noticing the telltale light had left the bunny's eyes and left behind a terrified and panic-ridden animal devoid of true intelligence. The keening cry of the wolf below brought Twilight's eyes back down to where the creature gripped the shattered remnants of its paw. Chunks of nearby wood twitched and slowly began to move towards the wolf, gathering at the base of the creature's wrist and moving to fill in the gaps Twilight had created when she blasted it. Looking down at the tree, Twilight could tell the beast had been close, though she didn't doubt that she had a few more well-placed blasts left in her. What she did doubt was the strength of the branch holding her up if whatever happened the first time happened again, and then she'd be forced to look for another tree. Looking around, Twilight couldn't see any branches thick enough to support her weight, and even the closest trees seemed to shy away from her. Brushing that thought aside, she looked around, past the trees and further into the wood. In the distance, the vibrant green of the forest was marred by a smattering of gray that stuck out like a black eye. Squinting, Twilight was barely able to make out a dried-up riverbed that had several large rocks along its side and top. The bottom was narrow and the sides were steep. If she could lure it closer, then she could loosen one of the boulders with her magic and use it to crush her foe and hopefully not her. If she teleported that far away, she may need tempting bait for the creature. Her eyes traveled up to the bunny that clung to the tallest branch with all four limbs shaking hard enough that it was nearly vibrating. Twilight shook her head.
No.
Live bait would work, but what would Fluttershy do?
She would be kind.
Letting out a sigh, Twilight looked down to the wolf just as the last remnants of its paw reassembled. The wolf stretched its new paw, testing it before setting it down and looking up at the unicorn, snarling. Live bait would work after all. Gritting her teeth, she teleported down and towards the cliff that she had seen in the distance, but not far enough that the beast would lose her scent. From her new vantage point, she could see the Timberwolf stop and look around, only to see a smaller morsel at the top of the tree and launch itself upwards. A dark thought entered Twilight's mind. If she ran now, the wolf might get the bunny, but it wouldn't get her. No, she shook her head and gritted her teeth. Fluttershy had shown her kindness, and she would too.
Hey! Why did you pick on someone your own size, you overgrown kindling?
The wolf's ears perked up on the top of its head, but it didn't stop. It leapt up to the lowest branch and began to heave itself upwards, its bulk straining the branch without even breaking it. Twilight lowered her horn and fired off another telekinetic push, the rolling ball of force rippling towards its target and flying right past. Cursing her aim, Twilight readied another until she thought again of the strange familiar trickle that she felt as the blast rolled past the creature. What was that sensation? An odd feeling of déjà vu filled her. She felt as though she had done this exact same thing before, only long ago. She was tempted to brush the feeling aside, but it was strangely captivating, leading her down a path that ended with a suggestion.
Pull.
Twilight didn't know where the thought came from, but the confidence and power that radiated demanded that she act. Without thinking, she followed the voice's demands. She pulled, willing the Timberwolf towards her and away from the defenseless little bunny clinging to the top of the tree. The Timberwolf lurched backwards, its body suddenly pulling away from the tree while its paws reached out and tried to grab the trunk. Twilight grunted, digging in her hooves and pulling with all of her magical might. The Timberwolf growled in frustration and pulled off the tree, breaking Twilight's grip and tumbling to the ground. Within an instant, the beast was back up, now facing the confused and vulnerable unicorn. But this time, there was no howl or snarl. It simply began to run directly at her as if its entire existence depended on reaching the strange unicorn. Twilight's hooves flew in a panic, nearly tripping over herself as she spun around and began running towards where she had seen the cliff, the lingering déjà vu replaced with blind panic. This time, the wolf didn't take its time dodging and weaving around all but the smallest trees and bushes. Simply leant into the larger trees, bowling them over despite the fact that such a tactic slowed it down. The previously careful hunter now seemed possessed, as if its mind was consumed with a single purpose, a single command. Firing off another short-range, half-calculated teleport, Twilight narrowly dodged the Timberwolf, catching up with her. However, the sudden expenditure of mana on constant running had taken its toll. She could already feel a strange sense of exhaustion beginning to overcome her. Her limbs felt heavy and her body was strangely empty. Pushing those thoughts from her mind, she ran on.
I will sleep when I'm dead,
she thought grimly. Breaking through a small bush, she could see the dry riverbed rise out of the forest, ignoring the obvious fact that such a thing should be impossible to simply appear in the middle of the forest. Sure enough, the large rocks that she had seen earlier were there, dotting the sides and top of the riverbed as if positioned there by some other force that foresaw her vulnerability. The Timberwolf burst through the brush a moment later, its weight crushing the foliage beneath it. The unicorn yelped and kept running, trying to think of ways that she could execute her plan without opening herself up to the wolf's jaws. She eyed the ridge and tried to quickly complete the necessary calculations, but the complexity of the spell was too much. The variables were simply too numerous. She had to take into account her speed, direction, and too many other things for a pony that still had to focus on not getting bitten in half by an undead tree monster. Ahead, she could see the sides of the riverbed slowly narrowing until it turned suddenly, becoming dangerously close together. Above her, a flash of pink caught her eye, and suddenly a boulder above 40 feet away came loose and began rolling down the sides of the riverbed. The thunderous howl of the great beast still in her tail made her legs fly into action once more. Pouring on what little speed she had left, Twilight pushed her heavy limbs to their limit, while no doubt testing the durability of her new brace. With a resounding crash, the boulder bounced off a ledge and rocketed into the air. It was at least 3 times bigger than the unicorn and would have no doubt turned her into paste if she didn't keep moving. Firing off one last short-range teleport, Twilight cried out in agony as a fresh surge of exhaustion morphed into a stab of pain. That was the least of her worries, and with the last few stumbling steps carried her under and past the falling rock shadow. The great rock narrowly missed the stumbling mare and instead landed squarely on the Timberwolf's neck, crushing the majority of the creature's upper body and separating its head from the rest of its body. Twilight stumbled, her hoof catching a loose rock and carrying her into a pile of smooth river rocks where she landed in a heap. Head spinning and senses scattered, she lifted her body only for dizziness to overcome her, forcing her to drop back into the pile of rocks. She sighed. Judging from the fact that half of her body hadn't been bitten off, she had to assume that the mysterious stranger had been successful in helping her. Either that or she was in some serious shock. She hardly even noticed the tumble of rocks and debris as the mysterious being slid down and landed next to her.
Hey, are you alright? Hello? Ever freed a random unicorn? Come in, Sparklebutt.
Her rescuer giggled and prodded her shoulder. Twilight grumbled, wincing as the headache pounded even harder in her head. Something about the mare just being close to her was enough to make her headache worse than falling face first into a bunch of rocks.
Back up, would you?
The unicorn mumbled. The mystery being took a tentative step back.
Well, it's good to hear they can still talk. I thought that last tumble might have knocked a few screws loose. I don't need help in that department.
Twilight thought grimly. Stumbling to her hooves, Twilight nearly toppled back into a heap. However, her forehoof found something curious. A small patch of greenery had grown beneath a cracked and dry riverbed. Though it was little more than 3 flowers and a hoofful of grass, it was vibrant and growing strong. Its life essence would just be barely enough to break the unicorn out of her funk, whether she knew it or not. The instant her hoof crushed the flowers and grass, she stopped, breathing in a deep and steadying breath. While the life beneath her hoof shriveled and died, becoming little more than a black patch of earth covered in a thin layer of dust, the mare became more alert. The exhaustion that plagued her was lessening enough to allow her senses to return. Steadying herself, Twilight let out a sigh, thankful her pounding headache had receded somewhat into a dull thumping at the back of her mind.
I'm okay, I just gotta breathe.
Opening her eyes, she turned, expecting to see the pony form of her wild soul friends, only to see a very different sight. The being before her was definitely equine. She was almost as tall as Twilight, which would make her easily tower over the bat ponies that she'd seen so far. Though she wasn't as tall as Twilight, she was easily much wider. Her limbs were stocky and incredibly well-muscled, and Twilight couldn't help but imagine how easy it would be for the being to crush her head like an oversized grape. Oh, and it was definitely a she, or at least Twilight assumed from the voice and the fact that its coat was offensively pink. Or at least Twilight assumed it was a she, maybe they used different pronouns or only had one gender. Twilight stared her savior up and down, her curiosity beating out her manners. Whoever they were, she looked like a pony, save for the fact that where its fur should be, there was a hard substance that reminded Twilight of stone. Twilight squinted. The substance definitely wasn't scales, but they did line up at regular intervals that seemed to serve as natural armor. They looked thick, and some seemed to glint in what little light there was, as if they had veins of minerals running through them. The only hair on the creature's body were its voluminous mane that leaped out of its skull and its equally poofy tail. Twilight blinked twice and realized that she was staring, and the being had said something.
I'm sorry, what? I'm a troll. That's why you're looking at me funny, right? Not literally funny, but you know.
She giggled. Her voice was definitely feminine, but there was a rumble, a promise of power just beneath the polite facade that it wore.
Yes, sorry, I've never met one of your kind before. I apologize for staring. Were you the one that knocked that boulder down?
Twilight motioned up to the place the boulder had been sitting mere moments ago. The creature smiled.
Yepers, that big nasty Timberwolf seemed a little peeved at you for some reason.
The mare giggled, glancing down to right where the empty eyes of the Timberwolf lay dormant. Its huge head was little more than an inert pile of twigs now.
Well, thank you very much,
Twilight winced, but the mare picked up on her awkwardness quickly.
Pinkie Pie.
She said with a smile.
Twilight Sparkle.
The unicorn extended her hoof, to which the troll enthusiastically bumped, a small tingling running up her limb after making contact with the unicorn.
Ooh, neato. Nice to meet you, Twilight. What were you doing way out here? Well, I was following my friend Fluttershy. She told me about a healer that could help fix my leg.
The unicorn lifted her back leg and showed it to the troll, who grimaced at the sight.
Youch. How long do you have until it turns into a tree? What?
Twilight spun around to find the brace had collected quite a few small branches and leaves during her mad dash throughout the woods. Rolling her eyes, Twilight lit her horn and extracted the plant matter between the brace and her leg. A presence stirred within the shattered remains of the Timberwolf the second her horn lit up. A lost soul saw her light and had leapt with a renewed vigor back into the body it had just been pushed out of. All at once, the disassembled head reassembled itself. Its eyes saw prey close and it lurched forward. Its belly rumbled, despite the fact that it didn't exist, and its teeth sought soft, undefended pink flesh. The troll screamed. A sudden pinch was all the warning that she got before her leg was bitten clean off in one swift bite. In her panic, the troll attempted to lurch forward, away from whatever it bit. She managed only a single stop before toppling to the ground in a heap that sent a tremor through the earth. Twilight backpedaled, narrowly avoiding getting crushed beneath the larger being. The bodiless Timberwolf messily tore into the dismembered leg, spraying bright green blood everywhere. The unicorn grit her teeth and lit her horn, firing off another concussive blast that sent the head spinning away. Losing the grasp on its neck, the Timberwolf tried to turn, but without a neck or body, all it could do was snap and growl angrily at the rock wall it was facing. Twilight stared down at the bodiless Timberwolf, only moving after it became apparent that it could do little more than snarl angrily at nothing. Letting out a sigh, Twilight turned away from the Timberwolf, readying herself for the grim task of helping some being that she had just met with getting their leg amputated. However, where she assumed there would be a scene out of a horror novel complete with crying and loads of blood stood a somewhat disheveled Pinkie Pie, balancing on the tips of her 3 remaining hooves, looking over Twilight's shoulder at the Timberwolf with considerably more calm than Twilight would have guessed.
Is it dead?
Twilight looked over her shoulder to where the Timberwolf remained. Its eyes spun backwards in their sockets to glare angrily at the pair.
Well, that's gonna be in my nightmares tonight. I guess. Whew.
The troll wiped the sweat from her brow and grinned.
We better get back to my teacher's place before another nasty critter like that shows up. Wait, doesn't that hurt?
Twilight grimaced, pointing down to the ravaged chunk of leg that was still bleeding strange green blood.
What, this?
Pinkie waved the quarter of her back leg still attached.
Nah, I lose legs all the time. Why, this is the 3rd time this month I lost righty.
She giggled, and turned towards the point of the cliff that she had slid down and called over her shoulder.
You coming?
Twilight shrugged and followed, morbidly fascinated at the fact that Pinkie seemed as adept on 3 legs as she was on 4, easily hopping up the slippery slide of the riverbed with little difficulty. The unicorn shook her head. The beings around here were strange, that much was certain. On the top of the cliff, Twilight stopped and took a breather, taking the time to look around for Fluttershy. That was quite the chase, and Timberwolves certainly don't mess around. That much was certain back then, and it's still certain now. Anyways, let's get on to our feisty donators. Top donators: Peter Coulthard, J Tinman, Darkside, Gauntlet, and only one thing. TacoCat598, Zar630, Strix, Raiden, Narwhals, Black Moonheart, Drake Lovedragon, Pastel Skies, Austin Roland, CrazyColor557, Stu Hex, Will, Omicron Lyrae, Dospo, Delta Omega, Jack Cadge, RuneScythe9852, Madman Stan, Leslie Perkett, Hunter Norman, Stephen Bingham, LineGod12, Sorcerer Constantine, Udzaza, and many more amazing people. Thank you all so much for watching this video and live life to the fullest.